Brideshead Revisited, The Sacred and Profane Memories of Captain Charles Ryder by Evelyn Waugh. I had slept until my servant called me, rose wearily, dressed and shaved in silence. It was not until I reached the door that I asked the second-in-command, "What's this place called?" He told me, and on the instant it was as though a voice that had been bawling in my ears, incessantly, fatuously, for days beyond number, had been suddenly cut short. Hooper came sidling up. "B Company relieved us. I've sent the chaps off to get cleaned up." "Good. The house is up there, round the corner." "Yes," I said. "Brigade headquarters are coming there next week. Great barrack of a place. I've just had a snoop round. Very ornate, I'd call it. And a queer thing, there's a sort of R.C. church attached. There's a frightful great fountain, too, in front of the steps, all rocks and sort of carved animals. You never saw such a thing." "Yes, Hooper, I did. I've been here before." The words seemed to ring back to me enriched from the vaults of my dungeon. "I have been here before," I said. I had been there before. First with Sebastian more than 20 years ago, on a cloudless day in June, when the ditches were creamy with meadowsweet, and the air heavy with all the scents of summer. That day, too, I had come not knowing my destination. It was Eights Week. Oxford in those days was still a city of aquatint. In her spacious and quiet streets, men walked and spoke as they had done in Newman's day. Here, discordantly, in Eights Week, came a rabble of womankind, some 100 strong, twittering and fluttering, all over the cobbles and up the steps. No one felt more strongly about it than my scout. "If you ask me, sir, it's all on account of the war." For this was 1923, and for Lunt, as for thousands of others, things could never be the same as they had been in 1914. Sebastian entered. Dove-grey flannel, white crepe de chine, a charvette tie. "Charles, what in the world's happening at your college? Is there a circus? I've seen everything except elephants. I must say the whole of Oxford has become most peculiar suddenly. Last night it was pullulating with women. You're to come away at once out of danger. I've got a motor car and a basket of strawberries and a bottle of Chateau Perrier, which isn't a wine you've ever tasted, so don't pretend. It's heaven with strawberries." "Where are we going?" "To see a friend." "Who?" "Name of Hawkins. The motor car is the property of a man called Hardcastle. Return the bits to him if I kill myself. I'm not very good at driving." Beyond the gate, beyond the winter garden that was once the lodge, stood an open two-seater Morris Cowley. Sebastian's teddy bear sat at the wheel. We put him between us. "Take care he's not sick," Sebastian instructed me, and we drove off. It was about 11 when Sebastian, without warning, turned the car into a cart track and stopped. It was hot enough now to make us seek the shade. On a sheep-cropped knoll, under a clump of elms, we ate the strawberries and drank the wine. As Sebastian promised, they were delicious together, and we lit fat Turkish cigarettes and lay on our backs, Sebastian's eyes on the leaves above him, mine on his profile. This was my third term since matriculation, but I date my Oxford life from the first meeting with Sebastian. I knew Sebastian by sight long before I met him. My first sight of him was in the door of Germa's, and on that occasion I was struck less by his looks than by the fact that he was carrying a large teddy bear. "That," said the barber as I took his chair, "was Lord Sebastian Flyte, a most amusing young gentleman." "Apparently," I said coldly. "The Marquis of Marchmont's second boy. His brother, the Earl of Brideshead, went down last term. Now he was a very different, a very quiet gentleman, quite like an old man. What do you suppose Lord Sebastian wanted? An airbrush for his teddy bear. He had to have very stiff bristles, not, Lord Sebastian said, to brush him with, but to threaten him with spanking when he was sulky." Nor, when at last we met, were the circumstances propitious. It was shortly before midnight in early March. I had been entertaining the college intellectuals to mulled claret. The fire was roaring, the air of my room heavy with smoke and spice, and my mind weary with metaphysics. I drew open my windows, and there appeared at my window the face I knew to be Sebastian's. He looked at me for a moment with unfocused eyes, and then, leaning well into the room, he was sick. There was a kind of insane and endearing orderliness about Sebastian's choice, in his extremity, of an open window. But when all is said, it remained an unpropitious meeting. A couple of jugs of mulled claret between the five of you, Lunt said. And this has to happen. Couldn't even get to the window. There's 5 shillings on the sideboard, I offered. So I saw and thank you, but I'd rather not have the money and not have the mess. Any morning. I took my gown and left him to his task. I still frequented the lecture room in those days, and it was after 11 when I returned to college. I found my room full of flowers. Lunt, what is all this? The gentleman from last night, sir, he left a note for you. The note was written in Conte crayon on a whole sheet of my choice drawing paper. I am very contrite. Aloysius won't speak to me until he sees I am forgiven, so please come to luncheon today. Sebastian Flyte. It was typical of him, I reflected, to assume I knew where he lived, but then I did know. A most amusing gentleman. I'm sure it's quite a pleasure to clean up after him. I take it you're lunching out, sir? Yes, Lunt. Lunching out. That luncheon party, for party it proved to be, was the beginning of a new epoch in my life. Sebastian lived at Christchurch, high in meadow buildings. He was alone when I came, peeling a plover's egg taken from the large nest of moss in the centre of his table. He was entrancing, with that epicene beauty which in extreme youth sings aloud for love, and withers at the first cold wind. The party assembled. There were 3 Etonian freshmen, each of whom, as he came into the room, made first for the plover's eggs. The first this year, they said. Where do you get them? Mummy sends them from Brideshead. They always lay early for her. When the eggs were gone and we were eating the lobster Newburg, the last guest arrived. My dear, he said, I couldn't get away before. I was lunching with my preposterous tutor. He thought it very odd my leaving when I did. I told him I had to change for footer. He was tall, slim, rather swarthy, with large saucy eyes. The rest of us wore rough tweeds and brogues. He had on suede shoes, a large bow tie, and he drew off yellow wash-leather gloves as he came into the room. Part Gallic, part Yankee, part perhaps Jew, wholly exotic. This, I did not need telling, was Anthony Blanche, the aesthete par excellence, a byword of iniquity from Charwell Edge to Somerville. And now meeting him, under the spell of Sebastian, I found myself enjoying him voraciously. That day was the beginning of my friendship with Sebastian, and thus it came about that morning in June that I was lying beside him in the shade of the high elms, watching the smoke from his lips drift up into the branches. Presently we drove on, and in the early afternoon came to our destination. We were at the head of a valley, and below us, half a mile distant, grey and gold, amid a screen of boscage, shone the dome and columns of an old house. Well, said Sebastian, stopping the car. What a place to live in, I said. You must see the garden front and the fountain. He leaned forward and put the car into gear. It's where my family live. And even then, wrapped in the vision, I felt momentarily an ominous chill at the words he used. Not, this is my house, but it's where my family live. Don't worry, he continued. They're all away. You won't have to meet them. But I should like to. Well, you can't. They're in London. We drove round the front into a side court. Everything's shut up. We'd better go in this way, and entered through the passages of the servants' quarters. I want you to meet Nanny Hawkins. That's what we've come for, and climbed uncarpeted, scrubbed elm stairs. Sebastian's nanny was seated at an open window. Her hands lay open in her lap, and loosely between them a rosary. She was fast asleep. Well, she said, waking, this is a surprise. Sebastian kissed her. Who's this? She said, looking at me. Sebastian introduced us. You've come just at the right time. Julia's here for the day. Such a time they're all having. It's dull without them. Just Mrs. Chandler and the 2 of the girls and old Bert. And then they're all going on holidays, and the boiler's being done out in August, and you're going to see his lordship in Italy, and the rest on visits. It'll be October before we're settled down. Do you say Julia's here? Asked Sebastian. Yes, dear. You must have just missed her. Now, what's the news? Are you studying hard at your books? Not very, I'm afraid, Nanny. Sebastian and the old woman talked on. Presently Nanny said, Ring the bell, dear, and we'll have some tea. But Sebastian said we had to go. And Miss Julia? She will be upset when she hears. would have been such a surprise for her. "Poor Nanny," said Sebastian when we left the nursery. "She does have such a dull life. I've a good mind to bring her to Oxford to live with me, and she'd always be trying to send me to church. We must go quickly before my sister gets back." "Which are you ashamed of, her or me?" "I'm ashamed of myself," said Sebastian gravely. "I'm not going to have you get mixed up with my family. They're so madly charming. All my life they've been taking things away from me. If they once got hold of you with their charm, they'd make you their friend, not mine, and I won't let them." "All right," I said. "I'm perfectly content. But am I not going to be allowed to see any more of the house?" "It's all shut up. We came to see Nanny. On Queen Alexandra's Day it's all open for £1. There are a few pretty things I'd like to show you one day, but not now. But there's the chapel. You must see that. It's a monument of Art Nouveau." We entered it by the public porch. Sebastian dipped his fingers in the water stoup, crossed himself, and genuflected. I copied him. "Why do you do that?" he asked crossly. "Just good manners." "Well, you needn't on my account. You wanted to do some sightseeing. How about this?" "Golly," I said, looking all around. "It was Papa's wedding present to Mamma. Now, if you've seen enough, we'll go." On the drive, we passed a closed Rolls-Royce driven by a chauffeur. In the back was a vague, girlish figure who looked round at us through the window. "Julia," said Sebastian. "We only just got away in time." Then we were away, past the Rawtown gates, past the lodges, and out onto the road heading back to Oxford. "I'm sorry," said Sebastian after a time. "I'm afraid I wasn't very nice this afternoon. Brideshead often has that effect on me. But I had to take you to see Nanny." After a long pause, he said petulantly, "I don't keep asking you questions about your family." "Well, neither do I about yours. But you look inquisitive." "Well, you're so mysterious about them." "I hoped I was mysterious about everything." "Perhaps I am rather curious about people's families. You see, it's not a thing I know about. There is only my father and myself." "Oh, how very unusual." His mood was lightening now. The further we drove from Brideshead, the more he seemed to cast off his uneasiness. The sun was behind us as we drove, so that we seemed to be in pursuit of our own shadows. That is the full account of my first brief visit to Brideshead. Could I have known then that it would one day be remembered with tears by a middle-aged captain of infantry? All that term I had been seeing rather more of Anthony Blanche than my liking for him warranted. Our frequent meetings were more of his choosing than mine, for I held him in considerable awe. In years he was barely my senior, but he seemed then to be burdened with the experience of the wandering Jew. At times we all seemed children beside him, at most times, but not always, for there was a bluster and zest in Anthony which the rest of us had shed somewhere in our more leisured adolescence, on the playing field or in the schoolroom. While we had been rolling one another in the mud at football and gorging ourselves with crumpets, Anthony had helped oil fading beauties on subtropical sands and had sipped his aperitif in smart little bars, so that the savage we had tamed was still rampant in him. He was cruel, too, in the wanton, insect-maiming manner of the very young. He asked me to dinner, and I was a little disconcerted to find that we were to dine alone. "We're going to Thame," he said. "There is a delightful hotel there. I can see that Sebastian has completely captivated you, my dear Charles. Well, I'm not surprised. Of course, you haven't known him as long as I have. I was at school with him. You wouldn't believe it, but in those days people used to say he was a little bitch. Just a few unkind boys who know him well. He never seemed to get into trouble. The rest of us were constantly being beaten in the most savage way, on the most frivolous pretexts, but never Sebastian. He and I were both Catholics, so we used to go to Mass together. He used to spend such a time in the confessional. I used to wonder what he had to say, because he never did anything wrong. Never quite. At least, he never got punished. Perhaps he was just being charming through the grill. The other day I was speaking to Sebastian about you, and I said, 'But you know Charles is an artist. He draws like a young Ingres.' And you know what Sebastian said? 'Yes, Aloysius draws very prettily too, but of course he's rather modern. So charming, so amusing.' Do you wish Sebastian was with us? Of course you do. Do I wonder. How our thoughts do run on that little bundle of charm, to be sure. I think you must be mesmerizing me, Charles. I bring you here at very considerable expense, my dear, simply to talk about myself, and I find I talk of no one except Sebastian. It's odd because there's really no mystery about him except how he came to be born into such a very sinister family. I forget if you know his family. I don't suppose he'll ever let you meet them. He's far too clever. They're quite gruesome. Do you ever feel there is something a teeny bit gruesome about Sebastian? No? Perhaps I imagine it. It's simply that he looks so like the rest of them sometimes. There's Brideshead, who's something archaic out of a cave that's been sealed for centuries. And Julia, you know what she looks like? Well, who could help it? Her photograph appears as regularly in the illustrated papers as the advertisements for Beecham's pills. So gay, so correct, so unaffected. I wonder if she's incestuous. I doubt it. All she wants is power. There ought to be an inquisition especially set up to burn her. There's another sister too, I believe, in the schoolroom. Nothing is known of her yet, except that her governess went mad and drowned herself not long ago. It's when one gets to the parents that the bottomless pit opens. My dear, such a pair! How does Lady Marchmain do it? She has convinced the world that Lord Marchmain is a monster. And what is the truth? They were married for 15 years or so, and then Lord Marchmain went to the war. He never came back, but formed a connection with a highly talented dancer. There are 1,000 such cases. She refuses to divorce him because she is so pious. Well, there have been cases of that before. Usually it arouses sympathy for the adulterer, not for Lord Marchmain, though, and she meanwhile keeps a small gang of enslaved and emaciated prisoners for her exclusive enjoyment. She sucks their blood. You could see the tooth marks all over Adrian Paulson's shoulders when he was bathing, and he, my dear, was the greatest, the only poet of our time. He's bled dry. There is nothing left of him. So you see, we mustn't blame Sebastian if at times he seems a little insipid. But then you don't blame him, do you, Charles? Well, my dear, I've no doubt that first thing tomorrow you'll trot round to Sebastian and tell him everything I've said about him. And I wish to tell you 2 things. One, that it will not make the slightest difference to Sebastian's feelings for me. And secondly, my dear, that he will immediately start talking about that amusing bear of his. Good night. Sleep innocently. The next morning, I made my way to Sebastian. "I've been to Mass at the old palace," he said. "I haven't been all this term, and Monsignor Bell asked me to dinner twice last week, and I know what that means. Mummy's been writing to him. How was dinner with Antoine? What did you talk about?" "Well, he did most of the talking. Tell me, did you know him at Eton?" "He was sacked my first half. I remember seeing him about. He has always been a noticeable figure." "Did he go to church with you?" "I don't think so. Why?" "Has he met any of your family?" "Charles, how very peculiar you're being today. No, I don't suppose so. Why all this interest?" "I just wanted to find out how much truth there was in what Anthony said last night." "I shouldn't think a word. That's his great charm." "Well, you may think it's charming. I think it's devilish. Do you know he spent the whole of yesterday evening trying to turn me against you, and almost succeeded." "Did he? How silly." "Aloysius wouldn't approve of that at all. Would you, you pompous old bear?" I returned home for the long vacation without plans and without money. While Sebastian had disappeared into that other life of his, where I was not asked to follow, I was left instead forlorn and regretful. I received 1 letter from Sebastian, a conspicuous object which was brought to me in my father's presence one day when he was lunching at home. I bore it away and read it in solitude. It was written on, and enveloped in, heavy late Victorian morning paper, black coroneted and black bordered. I read it eagerly. Brideshead Castle, Wiltshire. I wonder what the date is. Dearest Charles, I found a box of this paper at the back of a bureau, so I must write to you, as I am mourning for my lost innocence. It never looked like living. The doctors despaired of it from the start. Soon I am off to Venice to stay with my papa in his palace of sin. I wish you were coming. I wish you were here. I am never quite alone. Members of my family keep turning up and collecting luggage and going away again, but the white raspberries are ripe. I have a good mind not to take Aloysius to Venice. I don't want him to meet a lot of horrid Italian bears and pick up bad habits. Love, or what you will. S. I knew his letters of old. I should not have been disappointed, but that day I tore the stiff sheet across and let it fall into the basket, and gazed resentfully across the grimy gardens and irregular backs of Bayswater. For days after that, I thought I hated Sebastian. Then one Sunday afternoon a telegram came from him which dispelled that shadow, adding a new and darker one of its own. My father was out and returned to find me in a condition of feverish anxiety. "Father, I've got to leave at once." "Yes?" "A great friend of mine, he's had a terrible accident. I must go to him at once." I showed him the telegram, which read simply, "Gravely injured. Come at once, Sebastian." Paddington Station on that August Sunday evening, with the sun streaming through the obscure panes of its roof, the bookstall shut, and the few passengers strolling unhurried beside their porters, would have soothed a mind less agitated than mine. The train was nearly empty. I dined and changed trains to the local line, and in twilight came to Melstead Carberry, which was my destination. "Brideshead, sir?" "Yes, Lady Julia's in the yard." She was sitting at the wheel of an open car. I recognised her at once. I could not have failed to do so. "You're Mr. Ryder? Jump in." Her voice was Sebastian's, and his her way of speaking. "How is he?" "Sebastian? Oh, he's fine." "Well, what's happened to him?" "Oh, didn't he say? I expect he thought you wouldn't come if you knew. He's cracked a bone in his ankle so small that it hasn't got a name. But they x-rayed it yesterday and told him to keep it up for a month. I promised I'd stay if you failed him, so you can imagine how popular you are with me. I must say it's noble of you to come all this way at a moment's notice." But as she said it, I heard, or I thought I heard, a tiny note of contempt in her voice that I should be so readily available. Her dark hair was scarcely longer than Sebastian's, and it blew back from her forehead as his did. Her eyes on the darkling road were his, but larger. Her painted mouth was less friendly to the world. She wore a bangle of charms on her wrist, and in her ears little gold rings. She leaned forward to the lock for a box of cigarettes. "No, thanks." "Light one for me, will you?" It was the first time in my life that anyone had asked this of me, and as I took the cigarette from my lips and put it in hers, I caught a thin bat squeak of sexuality, inaudible to anyone but me. We had turned the corner of the drive now. "Here we are." She led me up the steps into the hall and flung her coat onto a marble table. At that moment Sebastian appeared, propelling himself in a wheelchair. He was in pyjamas and dressing gown, with one foot heavily bandaged. "Well, darling, I've collected your chum," she said, again with a barely perceptible note of contempt. "I thought you were dying," I said, conscious then, as I had been ever since I arrived, of the predominating emotion of vexation, rather than of relief, that I had been bilked of my expectations of a grand tragedy. "I thought I was too. The pain was excruciating. Julia, do you think if you asked him, Wilcox would give us champagne tonight?" "I hate champagne, and Mr. Ryder has had dinner." "Mr. Ryder? Mr. Ryder? Charles drinks champagne at all hours. Do you know, seeing this great swaddled foot of mine, I can't get it out of my mind that I have gout, and that gives me a craving for champagne. Good night, Mr. Ryder, and goodbye. I don't suppose we'll meet tomorrow. I'm leaving early. I can't tell you how grateful I am for you for relieving me at the sickbed." "My sister's very pompous tonight," said Sebastian when she was gone. "We'll have a heavenly time alone." When next morning I saw from my bathroom window Julia, with luggage at her back, drive from the forecourt and disappear at the hill's crest without a backward glance, I felt a sense of liberation and peace, such as I was to know years later when, after a night of unrest, the siren sounded the all-clear. The languor of youth, how unique and quintessential it is, how quickly, how irrecoverably lost. I believed myself very near heaven during those languid days at Brideshead. If Brideshead were mine, I'd never live anywhere else. But you see, Charles, it isn't mine. Just at the moment it is, but usually it's full of ravening beasts. If it could only be like this always summer, always alone, the fruit always ripe and aloysius in a good temper. It is thus I like to remember Sebastian, as he was that summer, when we wandered alone together through that enchanted palace. It was an aesthetic education to live within those walls. The terrace was the final consummation of the house's plan. In the centre, dominating the whole splendid space, rose the fountain, such a fountain as one might expect to find in a piazza of southern Italy. Sebastian set me to draw it. It was an ambitious subject for an amateur, but I brought it off, and by judicious omissions and some stylish tricks, produced a very passable echo of Piranesi. "Shall I give it to your mother?" I asked. "Why, you don't know her." "It seems polite. I'm staying in her house." "Give it to Nanny," said Sebastian. I did so, and she put it among the collection on the top of her chest of drawers, remarking that it had quite a look of the thing which she had often heard admired but could never see the beauty of herself. For me, the beauty was new-found. Since the days when, as a schoolboy, I used to bicycle round the neighbouring parishes, rubbing brasses and photographing fonts, I had nursed a love of architecture, but though in opinion I had made that easy leap, characteristic of my generation, from the Puritanism of Ruskin to the Puritanism of Roger Fry, my sentiments at heart were insular and medieval. This was my conversion to the Baroque. Here, under that high and insolent dome, under those coffered ceilings, here, as I passed through those arches and broken pediments to the pillared shade beyond, and sat, hour by hour, before the fountain, probing its shadows, tracing its lingering echoes, rejoicing in all its clustered feats of daring and invention, I felt a whole new system of nerves alive within me, as though the water that spurted and bubbled among its stones was indeed a life-giving spring. One day in a cupboard we found a large Japan tin box of oil paints still in workable condition. Mummy bought them a year or two ago. Someone told her that you could only appreciate the beauty of the world by trying to paint it. We laughed at her a great deal about it. She couldn't draw at all, and however bright the colours were in the tubes, by the time Mummy had mixed them up, they came out a kind of khaki. Various dry, muddy smears on the palette confirmed this statement. Cordelia was always made to wash the brushes. In the end, we all protested and made Mummy stop. The paints gave us the idea of decorating the office. This was a small room opening onto the colonnade. It had once been used for estate business, but was now derelict, holding only some garden games and a tub of dead aloes. It had been plainly designed for a softer use, perhaps as a tea-room or study, for the plaster walls were decorated with delicate rococo panels, and the roof was prettily groined. Here, in one of the smaller oval frames, I sketched a romantic landscape, and in the days that followed filled it out in colour, and, by luck and the happy mood of the moment, made a success of it. The brush seemed somehow to do what was wanted of it. It was a landscape without figures, a summer scene of white cloud and blue distances, with an ivy-clad ruin in the foreground, rocks, and a waterfall affording a rugged introduction to the receding parkland behind. I knew little of oil painting, and learned its ways as I worked. When, in a week, it was finished, Sebastian was eager for me to start on one of the larger panels. I made some sketches. He called for a fête champêtre with a ribbon swing and a Negro page and a shepherd playing the pipes, but the thing languished. I knew it was good chance that had made my landscape, and that this elaborate pastiche was too much for me. One day we went down to the cellars with Wilcox and saw the empty bays, which had once held a vast store of wine. One transept only was used now. There the bins were well stocked, some of them with vintages 50 years old. "There's been nothing added since his lordship went abroad," said Wilcox. "A lot of the old wine wants drinking up. We ought to lay down the 18s and the 20s. I've had several letters about it from the wine merchants, but her ladyship says to ask Lord Brideshead, but he says to ask his lordship, and his lordship says to ask the lawyers. That's how we get low. There's enough here for 10 years at the rate it's going, but how shall we be then?" Wilcox welcomed our interest. We had bottles brought up from every bin, and it was during those tranquil evenings with Sebastian that I first made serious acquaintance with wine, and sowed the seed of that rich harvest which was to be my stay in many barren years. We saw few strangers. On Sundays, a monk was fetched from a neighbouring monastery to say Mass and breakfast with us. He was the first priest I ever met. Sebastian's faith was an enigma to me at that time, but not one which I felt particularly concerned to solve. I had no religion. Often, almost daily, since I had known Sebastian, some chance word in his conversation had reminded me that he was a Catholic, but I took it as a foible, like his teddy bear. We never discussed the matter until on the second Sunday at Brideshead he surprised me by saying, "Oh dear, it's very difficult being a Catholic." "Does it make much difference to you?" "Of course. All the time." "Well, I can't say I've noticed it. Are you struggling against temptation? You don't seem much more virtuous than me." "I'm very, very much wickeder," said Sebastian indignantly. "Well then, if you can't see, you can't." "Well, where?" "Oh, don't be a bore, Charles." He turned back to the pages of the News of the World and said, "I want to read about a woman in Hull who's been using an instrument." "Well, you started the subject. I was just getting interested." "I'll never mention it again." But he did mention it again, some 10 days later, as we were lying on the roof of the house, sunbathing and watching through a telescope the agricultural show which was in progress in the park below us. Preparations had been going on for a week. "We shall have to hide," said Sebastian as the day approached. "My brother will be here. He's a big part of the agricultural show." So we lay on the roof under the balustrade. Brideshead came down by train in the morning. I met him for 5 minutes on his arrival. "Queer fellow, my brother," said Sebastian. "He looks normal enough." "Oh, but he's not. If only you knew. He's much the craziest of us, only it doesn't come out at all. He's all twisted inside. He wanted to be a priest, you know." "I didn't." "I think he still does. He nearly became a Jesuit, straight from Stonyhurst. It was awful for Mummy. He was the most upset, you see, when Papa went abroad. Much more than Mummy, really." "Has your father given up religion?" "Well, he's had to in a way. He only took to it when he married Mummy. When he went off, he left that behind with the rest of us. We're a mixed family, religiously. Brideshead and Cordelia are both fervent Catholics. He's miserable, she's bird-happy. Julia and I are half heathen. I am happy. I rather think Julia isn't. Mummy is popularly believed to be a saint, and Papa is excommunicated, and I wouldn't know which of them was happy. Anyway, however way you look at it, happiness doesn't seem to have much to do with it, and that's all I want. I wish I liked Catholics more." "They seem just like other people." "My dear Charles, that's exactly what they're not." We were interrupted in this unusually grave conversation by loud, childish cries from beyond the chimney stacks. "Sebastian! Sebastian!" "Good heavens," said Sebastian, reaching for a blanket. "That sounds like my sister Cordelia. Cover yourself up." There came into view a robust child of 10 or 11. She had the unmistakable family characteristics, but had them ill-arranged in a frank and chubby plainness. "Go away, Cordelia. We've got no clothes on." "Why, you're quite decent. I guessed you were here. You didn't know I was about, did you? I came down with Bridie. Darling Sebastian, I am pleased to see you again. How's your poor foot?" "Say how do you do to Mr. Ryder." "Oh, sorry, how do you do?" All the family charm was in her smile. We were a sombre little party that evening. Only Cordelia was perfectly at ease, rejoicing in the food, the lateness of the hour, and her brother's company. Brideshead was 3 years older than Sebastian and I, but he seemed of another generation. "I'm so sorry to miss so much of your visit," he said to me. "You are being looked after properly. I hope Sebastian is seeing to the wine. Wilcox is apt to be rather grudging when he's on his own. He's treated us very liberally. I'm delighted to hear it. You're fond of wine?" "Very." "I like wine," said Cordelia. My sister Cordelia's last report said that she was not only the worst girl in school, but the worst that had ever been in the memory of the oldest nun. "Bridie, you mustn't be pious," said Sebastian. "We've got an atheist with us." "Agnostic," I said. Religion seemed an inevitable topic that day. For some time we talked about the agricultural show. Then Brideshead said, "I saw the bishop in London last week. You know he wants to close our chapel." "Oh, he couldn't," said Cordelia. "I don't think Mummy will let him," said Sebastian. "You're an artist, Ryder," said Brideshead. "What do you think of it aesthetically?" "Well, I think it's beautiful," said Cordelia with tears in her eyes. "Is it good art?" "Well, I don't quite know what you mean," I said warily. "I think it's a remarkable example of its period. Probably in 80 years it will be greatly admired. But surely it can't be good 20 years ago and good in 80 years and not good now." "Well, it may be good now. All I mean is that I don't happen to like it much." "But is there a difference between liking a thing and thinking it good?" "Bridie, don't be so Jesuitical," said Sebastian. "I'm sorry," he said. "I just thought it rather an interesting point." "Thank God I went to Eton," said Sebastian. That night I began to realize how little I really knew of Sebastian, and to understand why he had always sought to keep me apart from the rest of his life. He was like a friend made on board a ship on the high seas. Now we had come to his home port. Brideshead and Cordelia went away. The month that had started in leisurely fashion came swiftly to its end. Sebastian walked without a stick now, and had forgotten his injury. "I think you'd better come with me to Venice," he said. "No money." "I thought of that. We live on Papa when we get there. The lawyers pay my fare, first class and sleeper. We can both travel third for that." And so we went. A sombre figure was there to meet us. "Papa's valet, Plender," whispered Sebastian to me. "I met the express," said Plender. "His lordship thought you must have looked up the train wrong. This seemed only to come from Milan." "We travelled third." Plender tittered politely and led us to the waiting gondola. The palace was a little less than it sounded, a narrow Palladian facade, mossy steps, and a dark archway of rusticated stone. "We'd better look respectable before meeting Papa," said Sebastian. "We needn't dress. I gather he's alone at the moment." I was full of curiosity to meet Lord Marchmain. When I did so, I was first struck by his normality, which, as I saw more of him, I found to be studied. "Darling Papa," said Sebastian, "how young you are looking." He kissed Lord Marchmain on the cheek, and I, who had not kissed my father since I left the nursery, stood shyly behind him. "This is Charles. Don't you think my father is very handsome, Charles?" Lord Marchmain shook my hand. "I hope you boys will be fairly comfortable upstairs. This house seems to have been designed for the comfort of only one person, and I am that one. I have a room the size of this, and a very decent dressing room. Cara has taken possession of the other sizable room." I was fascinated to hear him speak of his mistress so simply and casually. Later I suspected that it was done for effect, for me. "How is she?" "Cara? Well, I hope. She will be back with us tomorrow. She's visiting some American friends. Would you be too dull at home? Cara is sure to want to go out tomorrow, and the cook here is really quite excellent." As we went up to bed that night, Sebastian said, "He's rather a puppet, isn't he?" Lord Marchmain's mistress arrived next day. I was 19 years old and completely ignorant of women. I could not with any certainty recognize a prostitute in the streets. I was therefore not indifferent to the fact of living under the roof of an adulterous couple, but I was old enough to hide my interest. I remember most particularly one conversation towards the end of my visit. It was the first time we had been alone together. "I think you are very fond of Sebastian," she said. "Why, certainly. I know of these romantic friendships of the English and the Germans. They are not Latin. I think they are very good if they do not go on too long." She was so composed and matter-of-fact that I could not take her amiss, but I failed to find an answer. She stirred on her sofa. "Sebastian drinks too much." "I suppose we both do." "With you, it does not matter. I have watched you together. With Sebastian, it is different. He will be a drunkard if someone does not come to stop him. I have known so many. Alex was nearly a drunkard when he met me. It is in the blood. I see it in the way Sebastian drinks. It is not your way." We arrived back in London on the day before term began. It was the first Sunday evening of term. "I feel precisely 100 years old," said Sebastian. I've had a talking to from Monsignor Bell this afternoon. That makes the 4th since I came up. My tutor, the junior dean, Mr. Samgrass of All Souls, and now Monsignor Bell. Who is Mr. Samgrass of All Souls? Oh, just someone of Mummy's. They all say that I made a very bad start last year, and that I've been noticed, and that if I don't mend my ways, I shall get sent down. I mean, how does one mend one's ways? Oh, Charles, what has happened since last term? I feel so old. We sat silent in the firelight as darkness fell. Anthony Blanche has gone down. Why? He wrote to me. Apparently he's taken a flat in Munich. He's formed an attachment to a policeman there. I shall miss him. I suppose I shall too, in a way. All that term and all that year, Sebastian and I lived more and more in the shadows, and, like a fetish hidden first from the missionary and at length forgotten, the toy bear Aloysius sat unregarded on the chest of drawers in Sebastian's bedroom. There was a change in both of us. We had lost the sense of discovery which had infused the anarchy of our first year. I began to settle down. I started my second year by joining the Ruskin School of Art. 2 or 3 mornings a week we met amongst the casts from the antique at the Ashmolean Museum. Twice a week we drew from the nude in a small room over a tea shop. Thus soberly dressed and happily employed, I became a fairly respectable member of my college. With Sebastian, it was different. His year of anarchy had filled a deep, interior need of his, the escape from reality. And as he found himself increasingly hemmed in, where he once felt himself free, he became at times listless and morose, even with me. We kept very much to our own company that term, each so much bound up in the other that we did not look elsewhere for friends. It was thus that Lady Marchmain found us when she came for a week to Oxford. She accepted me as Sebastian's friend, and sought to make me hers also, and in doing so unwittingly struck at the roots of our friendship. That is the single reproach I have to set against her abundant kindness to me. One Monday morning a week or 2 later, I was in Sebastian's room waiting for him to return from a tutorial, when Julia walked in, followed by a large man whom she introduced as Mr. Mottram and addressed as Rex. "We hoped Sebastian might give us luncheon," she said. "Failing him, we can always try Boy Mulcaster, but I somehow thought we should eat better with Sebastian, and we're very hungry. He and Sebastian are both lunching with me. Come too." So, without demur, they joined the party in my rooms. Rex Mottram exerted himself to make an impression. He spoke with an engaging Canadian accent. One quickly learned all that he wished one to know about him, that he was a lucky man with money, a member of Parliament, a gambler, a good fellow, that he played golf regularly with the Prince of Wales. He cannot have been more than 30 at the time we met him, but he seemed very old to us. We were slightly surprised a week later to get a telegram from him asking us and Boy Mulcaster to dinner in London on the following night for a party of Julia's. We discussed it, and because our life at Oxford was now so much in the shadows, we decided we would. Why does he want Boy? Julia and I have known him all our lives. I suppose finding him at lunch with you, he thought he was a chum. We had no great liking for Mulcaster, but the 3 of us were in high spirits when, having got leave for the night from our colleges, we drove off on the London road. We were to spend the night at Marchmain House. Rex Mottram was a liberal host, and by the end of dinner, the 3 of us, who had come from Oxford, were rather drunk. Mulcaster said, "I say, let's step away from this ghastly dance and go to Ma Mayfield's." "Who is Ma Mayfield?" "You know Ma Mayfield. Everyone knows Ma Mayfield of the Old Hundredth. I've got a regular there, sweet little thing called Effie." "All right," said Sebastian. "Let's meet Effie at Ma Mayfield's." Presently the 3 of us were together on the pavement. "Do you know where this place is?" "It is just off Leicester Square. Better take the car." "Why?" "Always better to have one's own car on an occasion like this." We did not question this reasoning, and there lay our mistake. Mulcaster drove, and after some wandering, brought us safely to Sink Street. A commissionaire at one side of a dark doorway indicated our destination. Inside it was hot and crowded, for the Old Hundredth was then at the height of its success. We found a table and ordered a bottle. The waiter took payment before he opened it. "Where's Effie tonight?" asked Mulcaster. "Effie who?" "I'll go and look for her," said Mulcaster. Presently, Mulcaster returned in triumph with Effie. Soon she and Mulcaster were deep in conversation. Sebastian leaned back and said to me, "I'm going to ask that pair to join us." He indicated two unattached women who had considered us earlier and who were again circling towards us. One had the face of a skull, the other of a sickly child. The death's head seemed destined for me. "How about a little party?" she said. "Just the six of us over at my place." "Certainly," said Sebastian. "We thought you were fairies when you came in." "That was our extreme youth." Death's head giggled. "You're a good sport," she said. It was still early, not long after midnight, when we regained the street. The commissioner tried to persuade us to take a taxi. "I'll look after your car, sir. I wouldn't drive yourself, sir. Really, I wouldn't." But Sebastian took the wheel, and the two women sat one on the other beside him to show him the way. Effie and Mulcaster and I sat in the back. We did not drive far. We turned into Shaftesbury Avenue and were making for Piccadilly when we narrowly escaped a head-on collision with a taxicab. Two policemen quickened their stride and approached us. The policemen looked us over, deliberately forming their own judgment. Even then, everything might have been well had not Mulcaster joined in. "Look here, my good man," he said. "There's no need for you to notice anything. We've just come from Ma Mayfield's. I reckon she pays you a nice retainer to keep your eyes shut. Well, you can keep 'em shut on us too, and you won't be the losers by it." That resolved any doubts which the policeman may have felt. In a short time we were in the cells. I sat on the bunk in low spirits and dozed a little. Presently the racket subsided, and Sebastian called, "I say, Charles, are you there?" "Here I am." "This is a hell of a business. Can't we get bail or something?" Mulcaster seemed to have fallen asleep. "I tell you the man, Rex Mottram. He'd be in his element here," Sebastian called. An hour later Rex stood in the charge room, looking the embodiment, indeed the burlesque, of power and prosperity. I was clear-headed now, and watched and listened with fascination while Rex settled our business. He undertook to deliver us at the magistrate court at 10 next morning, and then led us away. His car was outside. Rex joined us at breakfast the next morning. "It's important to make a good appearance at the court," he said. "Luckily, none of you look much the worse for wear." After breakfast, the barrister arrived, and Rex delivered a summary of the case. "Sebastian's in a jam," he said. "We shall need a Don to give evidence of good character. Julia tells me you have a tame one called Samgrass. He'll do. Meanwhile, your story is simply that you came up from Oxford for a perfectly respectable dance, weren't used to wine, had too much, and lost the way driving home." Everything happened at court as Rex had predicted. At 10:30 we stood in Bow Street, Mulcaster and I free men, Sebastian bound over to appear in a week's time. Mulcaster had kept silent about his grievance. He and I were admonished and fined 5 shillings each and 15 shillings costs. Mulcaster was becoming rather irksome to us, and it was with relief that we heard his plea of other business in London. The barrister bustled off, and Sebastian and I were left alone and disconsolate. "I suppose Mummy's got to hear about it," he said. Damn. It's cold. I won't go home. I've nowhere to go. Let's just slip back to Oxford and wait for them to bother us." The raffish habitués at the police court came and went, up and down the steps. Still we stood on the windy corner, undecided. Why not get hold of Julia? I might go abroad. My dear Sebastian, he'll only be given a talking to and fined a few pounds. Yes, but it's all the bother. Mummy and Bridie and all the family and the Dons. I'd sooner go to prison. If I just slip away abroad, they can't get me back, can they? I mean, that's what people do when the police are after them. I know Mummy will make it seem she has to bear the whole brunt of the business. Well, let's telephone Julia and get her to meet us somewhere and talk it over. We met at Gunter's in Berkeley Square. Julia, like most women then, wore a green hat pulled down to her eyes with a diamond arrow in it. She had a small dog under her arm, 3/4 buried in the fur of her coat. She greeted us with an unusual show of interest. "Well, you are a pair of pickles. I must say you look remarkably well in it. The only time I got tight, I was paralysed all the next day. Do you think you might have taken me with you? The bull was positively lethal, and I've always longed to go to the Old Hundredth. No one will ever take me. Is it heaven? So you want to know all about that too? Rex telephoned me this morning and told me everything. What were your girlfriends like?" "Don't be prurient," said Sebastian. "Mine was a skull. Mine was like a consumptive. Goodness! It had clearly raised us in Julia's estimation that we had been out with women. To her, they were the point of interest. Does Mummy know? Not about your skulls and consumptives. She knows you were in the clink. I told her. She was divine about it, of course. You know, anything Uncle Ned did was always perfect, and he got locked up once for taking a bear into one of Lloyd George's meetings, so she really feels quite human about the whole thing. She wants you both to lunch with her. Oh, God. The only trouble is the papers and the family. Have you got an awful family, Charles?" "Only a father. He'll never hear about it. Ours are awful. Poor Mummy is in for a ghastly time with them. They'll be writing letters and paying visits of sympathy, and all the time, at the back of their minds, one half will be saying, 'That's what comes of bringing the boy up a Catholic,' and the other half will say, 'That's what comes of sending him to Eton instead of Stonyhurst.' Poor Mummy, can't get it right." We lunched with Lady Marchmain. She accepted the whole thing with humorous resignation. Her only reproach was, "I can't think why you went off and stayed with Mr. Mottram. You might have come and told me about it first." "How am I going to explain it to all the family?" she asked. "They will be so shocked to find that they're more upset about it than I am. Do you know my sister-in-law, Fanny Roscommon? She has always thought that I brought the children up badly. Now I'm beginning to think that she must be right. When we left, I said, 'She couldn't have been more charming. What were you so worried about?' 'I can't explain,' said Sebastian miserably. A week later, when Sebastian came up for trial, he was fined £10. The most lasting penalty we suffered was our intimacy with Rex Mottram and Mr. Samgrass. But since Rex's life was in London, in a world of politics and high finance, and Mr. Samgrass is nearer to our own town at Oxford, it was from him we suffered the more. But the shadows were closing round Sebastian. We returned to Oxford, but it was not as it had been. There was midwinter in Sebastian's heart. I got a note from Lady Marchmain which said, "I shall be passing through Oxford on Tuesday and hope to see you and Sebastian. I would like to see you alone for 5 minutes before I see him. Is that too much to ask? I will come to your rooms at about 12. She came. She admired my rooms. And finally, she came to her point. "I expect you've guessed already what I have come to ask. Quite simply, is Sebastian drinking too much this term?" I had guessed. I answered, "If he were, I shouldn't answer. As it is, I can say no." She said, "I believe you. Thank God." And we went together to luncheon at Christchurch. That night, Sebastian was found by the junior dean at 1 o'clock, wandering round Tomquad hopelessly drunk. The next morning, Sebastian came to tell me about it. We both knew that this was a crisis. I had no love for Sebastian that morning. He needed it, but I had none to give. "Really," I said, "if you're going to embark on a solitary bout of drinking every time you see a member of your family, it's perfectly hopeless." But my pride was stung because I'd been made to look of liar, and I could not respond to his need. "Well, what do you propose to do?" "I shan't do anything. They'll do it all." And I let him go without comfort. Then the machinery began to move. Mr. Samgrass and Monsignor Bell saw the Dean of Christchurch. Brideshead came up for a night. The heavy wheels stirred, and the small wheels spun. Everyone was exceedingly sorry for Lady Marchmain. She came to see me. "You must believe," I said, "that when I told you Sebastian was not drinking, I was telling you the truth as I knew it. I know you wish to be a good friend to him. Now, that is not what I mean. I believed what I told you." "It's no good, Charles," she said. "All you can mean is that you have not as much influence or knowledge of him as I thought. You know we are all fond of you, apart from your being Sebastian's friend. But I want Sebastian to have all sorts of friends, not just one. Monsignor Bell tells me he never mixed with the other Catholics. Well, I said, have you a remedy? The college are being extraordinarily kind. They say they will not send him down, provided he goes to live with Monsignor Bell. Lady Marchmain, if you want to make him a drunkard, that's the way to do it. Oh dear, it's no good trying to explain. Protestants always think Catholic priests are spies. We had reached a deadlock. With scarcely another word, I saw her to the convent, where she was staying, then took the bus back to Carfax. Sebastian was in my rooms waiting for me. I'm going to cable Papa, he said. He won't let them force me into this priest's house. I told her it wouldn't do, I said. Shall we get really drunk tonight? It's the one time it could do no conceivable harm, I said. Contra mundum? Contra mundum. Bless you, Charles. There aren't many evenings left to us. And that night, the first time for many weeks, we got deliriously drunk together. Next day, Lady Marchmain left Oxford, taking Sebastian with her. There were only 10 days of term to go. I got through them somehow, and returned to London. Father, do you particularly want me to take my degree? I want you to. Good gracious. Why should I want such a thing? No use to me. Not much to you either, as far as I've seen. I only thought that if I was not going to take up one of the professions where a degree is necessary, it might be best to start now on what I intend doing. I intend to be a painter. But to this my father made no answer at the time. The idea, however, seemed to take root in his mind. By the time we spoke of the matter again, it was firmly established. When you're a painter, he said, you'll need a studio. Yes. Well, there isn't a studio here. There isn't even a room you could use decently as a studio. I'm not going to have you painting in the gallery. Well, I don't suppose I should do much painting the first year. Anyway, I should be working at a school. Abroad? Asked my father hopefully. There are some excellent schools abroad, I believe. It was all happening rather faster than I intended. Well, abroad or here, I should have to look around first. Look around abroad, he said. Then you agree to my leaving Oxford? Agree? Agree, oh, my dear boy. You're 22. 20, I said. 21 in October. Is that all? It seems much longer. A letter from Lady Marchmain completed this episode. My dear Charles, she wrote, Sebastian left me this morning to join his father abroad. Before he went, I asked him if he had written to you. He said no, so I must write. The college has sent Sebastian down for a term only, and will take him back after Christmas, on condition he goes to live with Monsignor Bell. It is for him to decide. Meanwhile, Mr. Samgrass has very kindly consented to take charge of him. As soon as his visit to his father is over, Mr. Samgrass will pick him up, and they will go together to the Levant. He hopes this may be a new interest for Sebastian. Sebastian's stay here has not been happy. When they come home at Christmas, I know Sebastian will want to see you, and so shall we all. Yours sincerely, Teresa Marchmain. So it was that the next time I saw Sebastian was at Brideshead, when he and Mr. Samgrass had returned from the Levant. Here, said Mr. Samgrass, is a group taken by a street photographer on the terrace of the St. George Hotel at Beirut, and there's Sebastian. Why, I said, there's Anthony Blanche, surely. Oh, yes, we saw quite a lot of him. Met him by chance at Constantinople. Tea had been cleared away and the curtains drawn. It was 2 days after Christmas, the first evening of my visit, the first two of Sebastian's and Mr. Samgrass's. Mr. Samgrass was not at ease. He kept up a lively account of his tour during tea, and then Lady Marchmain drew him away with her upstairs for a little talk. Come and see Nanny, said Sebastian when they'd gone. Please, can I come too? Said Cordelia. Come on. We climbed to the nursery in the dome. On the way, Cordelia said, Aren't you at all pleased to be home? Of course I'm pleased, said Sebastian. Well, you might show it a bit. I've been looking forward to it so much. Nanny did not particularly wish to be talked to. She liked visitors best when they had paid no attention to her and let her knit away and watch their faces and think of them as she had known them as small children. "Well," she said, "you are looking peaky. I expect it's all that foreign food doesn't agree with you." Sebastian certainly did look ill. 5 months had wrought the change of years in him. He was paler, thinner, and there was a wariness in his eye. Restrained by this wariness, I asked him nothing of himself, but told him instead about my autumn and winter. I told him about my rooms in Paris and the art school, and how good the old teachers were and how bad the students. "Charles," said Cordelia, "modern art is all bosh, isn't it?" "Great bosh. Oh, I'm so glad. I had an argument with one of our nuns, and now I shall tell her that I've had it straight from a real artist, and snubs to her." Presently it was time for Cordelia to go to her supper, and for Sebastian and me to go down to the drawing-room for our cocktails. There was no sign of the cocktail tray. After a few minutes, Sebastian rang the bell. A footman answered. "Mr. Wilcox is upstairs with her ladyship." "Well, never mind. Bring in the cocktail things." "Mr. Wilcox has the keys, my lord." "Oh, well, send him in with them when he comes down." We talked a little about Anthony Blanche. He had a beard in Istanbul, but I made him take it off. And after 10 minutes, Sebastian said, "Well, I don't want a cocktail anyway. I'm off to my bath," and left the room. It was 7:30. I supposed the others had gone to dress, but as I was going to follow them, I met Brideshead coming down. "Just a moment, Charles. There's something I've got to explain. My mother has given orders that no drinks are be left in any of the rooms." "Is that necessary?" "I gather very necessary. Will you have a cocktail now that he's gone upstairs?" It would choke me. It was an evening of peculiar gloom. We dined in the painted parlour. I watched the champagne go round the table. When it came to Sebastian, he said, "I'll have whisky, please," and I saw Wilcox glance over his head to Lady Marchmain, and saw her give a tiny, hardly perceptible nod. At Brideshead they used small individual spirit decanters, which held about 1/4 of a bottle. The decanter which Wilcox put before Sebastian was half empty. Sebastian raised it very deliberately, tilted it, looked at it, and then, in silence, poured the liquid into his glass, where it covered 2 fingers. After dinner, Brideshead asked his mother to read, and she read the diary of a nobody with great spirit until 10 o'clock, when she closed the book and said she was unaccountably tired, so tired that she would not visit the chapel that night. "Who's hunting tomorrow?" she asked. "Cordelia," said Brideshead. "I'm taking that young horse of Julia's just to show him the hounds. I shan't keep him out more than a couple of hours." "Rex is arriving some time," said Julia. "I'd better stay in to greet him." "Where's the meet?" said Sebastian suddenly. "Just here at Flytes St. Mary." "Then I'd like to hunt, please, if there's anything for me." Everyone was suddenly pleased that Sebastian wanted to hunt. It seemed to undo some of the mischief of the evening. Next morning, when the others were already mounted, Sebastian beckoned me into the hall. On the table lay the flask he'd put out to be filled. He picked it up and shook it. It was empty. "You see," he said, "I can't even be trusted that far. It's they who are mad, not me. Now you can't refuse me money." I gave him £1. "More?" he said. I gave him another, and watched him mount and trot off after his brother and sister. It was touching, the faith which everybody put in the value of a day's hunting. It was about half an hour after tea when Wilcox brought in the cocktail tray and said, "Lord Sebastian has just rung up to be fetched from South Twining." "South Twining?" said Cordelia. "Goodness, he did get lost." When he arrived, he was flushed, and his eyes were feverishly bright. I saw that he was 2/3 drunk. "Dear boy," said Lady Marchmain, "how nice to see you looking so well again. Your day in the open has done you good. The drinks are on the table. Do help yourself." There was nothing unusual in her speech but the fact of her saying it. 6 months ago it would not have been said. "Thanks," said Sebastian. "I will." Next morning I said to Sebastian, "Tell me honestly, do you want me to stay on here?" "No, Charles, I don't believe I do." "I'm no help?" "No help." So I went to make my excuses to his mother. "There's something I must ask you, Charles. Did you give Sebastian money yesterday?" "Yes." "Knowing how he was likely to spend it?" "Yes." "I don't understand it," she said. "I simply don't understand how anyone could be so callously wicked. I don't understand how you can have been so nice in so many ways and then do something so wantonly cruel. I don't understand how we all liked you so much. Did you hate us all the time? I don't understand how we deserved it." I was unmoved. There was no part of me remotely touched by her distress. It was, as I had often imagined, being expelled from school. But as I drove away and turned back in the car to take what promised to be my last view of the house, I felt that I was leaving part of myself behind, and that, wherever I went afterwards, I should feel the lack of it and search for it hopelessly, as ghosts are said to do, frequenting the spots where they buried material treasures without which they cannot pay their way to the netherworld. I shall never go back, I said to myself.